afternoon, everyone. My name is Alicia. Welcome to our Asset Recycling, an alternative approach to P3's webinar today. We are glad everyone is joining us. Just a little bit about T4A. Transportation for America is an alliance of elected and business and civic leaders from communities across the country and country that wants smart, locally driven transportation solutions, and because of that, these are the investments that hold the key to our future economic prosperity. Just a little bit about logistics for the call today. We are only taking questions via chat, so if you have questions throughout our webinar, please type them at the chat box at the left-hand side of your screen, and we will go ahead and answer them at the very end of the webinar. Today's experts, we have Beth Osborne, and she's our Vice President of Transportation here at Transportation for America, and we also have Rob Puentes, and he is our President and CEO at the Eno Center for Transportation. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Beth?
Thank you, Alicia. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. This is an area that has been coming up more and more as our federal leaders in particular are looking for ways to address challenges for transportation funding. And since the term asset recycling is relatively new to the public discourse, but is coming up in more and more articles, we thought it was important to have a webinar about what asset recycling is and what it is not. So we're going to start with what it is. Asset recycling is the selling or leasing of public assets and then using the proceeds for that sale or lease to pay for other infrastructure needs. Asset recycling involves two pieces of infrastructure: the asset that's being sold or leased and is generating funding from that sale or lease that you give to the private sector, and then a second piece of infrastructure that you use the funding from the first to make improvements to. The asset recycling terminology comes from the idea that the value of the old asset is being recycled. It is not the notion that the asset itself is being recycled. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, this sounds an awful lot like a P3. It's just another kind of public-private partnership. It is another type of public-private partnership, but it differs from the typical public-private partnership that we are familiar with. And that is because in asset recycling, there are two different assets that are at issue. Let's talk about a P3 real quick. In your typical P3, let's say you have a toll road, and you know it is going to generate revenue from those tolls. You might, A, decide to keep that money within the public sector, or B, sell or lease the asset to the private sector to manage the toll authority and use the proceeds from those tolls to maintain and improve the authority maintain or improve the asset according to predetermined goals or conditions. With asset recycling, instead of taking the money thrown off from that asset to maintain the asset and keeping it all within that one toll road, for example, instead what you're doing is you're saying, maybe I have an airport and I will sell you my airport, and then it's on you to deal with, and I'm going to take that money and use that money to resurface my roads. So they are related, but they are not the same thing, and you may be selling off your income generator for a one-time bolstering of cash. So as I said, asset recycling is not a recycling of the asset itself, it is recycling of the value of the asset into other infrastructure. Unless unused excess public property is being sold off, the fundamental underlying principle of asset recycling is that the public entity privatizes a public asset to gain access to capital in the short term. So it's very important to say it's not a long-term source of funding. If you toll a road, that toll, as long as that road is open, could be a long-term source of funding to your system. But if you sell off the road and allow somebody else to toll it and keep it all to themselves, then all you get is the proceeds of the sale. All right, so at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Rob, and he's going to talk through some very specific examples of this sort of work being done and what has worked and what has not.
Thanks very much, Beth, and thanks, Alicia. Thanks for having me here. As Beth was saying, that there is a lot of interest in asset recycling now, given this interest nationally in investing in infrastructure and the lack of any kind of clarity about really what a national program looks right now. This has been one solution or one strategy that's been offered, but I think there's still a lot of confusion about what it is and what it isn't, as Beth said. So I'm going to walk through a couple of quick case studies to give you an idea of where this has been tried before. We're going to start with an example from Australia, from New South Wales. This is actually probably the one example that's a clear part of a national program. The two examples we have here in the United States, in Virginia, here in the Washington, D.C. region, and in Indiana on their toll road are examples of cases which can be considered to be asset recycling, even though they're not part of any kind of formal national program. So we'll start off with Australia. I think for those who don't know, New South Wales is I guess it's a state or a province in Australia. It is the most populous in the country. It's home to metropolitan Sydney, and it's about 1/3 of the national GDP is there in that province. The case study you want to focus on is the transaction regarding the electric grid, which they used as an asset recycling scheme. First, I want us to talk about, though, this national program under which this transaction sits. This is the result of a national initiative that was launched in 2014. It was designed to be a 2-year initiative, really focusing on the Australian government's interest in promoting P3s as an infrastructure financing tool. This is not something that was kind of an ad hoc initiative. This was something that's part of a formal, ongoing interest that country has in P3s. Probably one of the global leaders in engaging in these kinds of partnerships. The federal government there, the national government, used $5 billion to incentivize privatization in infrastructure, in all kinds of infrastructure, not just transportation, but things like ports, power stations, transmission lines, mostly things that have a revenue source. That's very important. We'll get back to that in a second. But in this case, the federal government was so interested in this happening that they provided a 15% match to incentivize states and municipalities to engage in these kinds of partnerships. So they gave a direct cash contribution to projects construction if they engaged in one of these kinds of asset recycling schemes. And it's important to note that this addressed mostly state and territory-owned infrastructure, not municipal infrastructure. The money that they used for the 15% match came from this asset recycling fund, which they had established, which was uncommitted money they used to have in something called the Building Australia Initiative. So in New South Wales, the province or the state that took advantage of this program most heavily, to about $8 billion worth of transactions. Most notably was the New South Wales electric grid, which is something that the transaction occurred in 2016, where the New South Wales government, should say actually leased its electricity distribution system there with the incentive that they had from the national government, and then use those funds to support a range of projects around the country, around the province, large road projects and large rail projects, including the massive expansion of the Sydney Metro Rail in that metropolitan area. The important thing here to note is that they didn't just do this kind of a backroom deal. This was under the auspices of something called Infrastructure New South Wales, which is an independent advisory body that they created to identify and prioritize investments with the ostensible goal to depoliticize how those investments were made, to build trust with the public sector, and to give the private sector assurances that the investments were going to be made in the most appropriate manner. It's important to note that Infrastructure New South Wales advised on which projects they should be funding, but the ultimate responsibility came down to the Premier and the Treasurer. They were allowed to accept or refuse the projects that were identified, but not to tweak them. So it really was one example of where a new governance structure was used to try to identify these projects and then figure out ways that you could finance them. They manage a fund called Restart New South Wales. which again was supported by the funds from the asset recycling scheme. The next case study I want to talk about is in Virginia. It's here in Northern Virginia on Interstate 66, what they call outside the Washington Beltway. There's a lot of toll road projects that are under new experiments that are going on all around Northern Virginia. This is one 22-mile piece in Northern Virginia between the Beltway and the outer suburbs. And this is a project that was engaged about a year ago, I think this time in 2016, maybe late 2016, where VDOT partnered with Express Mobility Resources or Express Mobility Partners to build express lanes outside the Beltway where it could then collect the tolls. So to try to address a chronic congestion problem on this highway, the state realized it needed to make some improvements to things like bridges. It needed to add a lane. They didn't want to just make that a traditional highway lane. They wanted to have that tolled, and they engaged with a private partner to do that. The important thing here is that the state actually figured out how much it was going to cost them to do the project by themselves, and then kind of put it out to bid to see if a private partner could beat it, and one of them did. So in this case, it's actually asset recycling because even though the value of the project wasn't moved to someplace else outside of the corridor, like in Australia or other places, but in this case, in exchange for the project rights, the state got money that they used to improve transit service in the corridor and for a whole range of other improvements in that corridor over the next 50 years. So the important thing here, and similar to New South Wales, the state knew what it wanted to get done. They put it out for bid, and they were able to use that money to solve a range of different problems and to achieve different public policy goals than just the monetization of the asset in an abstract way. It was very specific, it was very transparent, and they knew what they wanted to get out of it. The last one that I want to talk about is probably the most prominent in the U.S., the one that's cited the most is the East-West Toll Road in Indiana, often known as the Indiana Toll Road. This was a project that was Governor Mitch Daniels was the prime mover behind in 2005. He was in office and he wanted to create a statewide transportation plan that he called Major Moves, which was funding projects all throughout the state. He needed money to do that, and so he figured that he would monetize this asset in the north part of Indiana, which is a toll road connecting Chicago with the Ohio Turnpike. So a heavily used road, one that where folks were already paying tolls, and one which there was a lot of interest in the private sector in which to invest. So they engaged in a joint venture with different different private partners, and then who had the right to operate that toll road for 75 years. The winning bidders came in and gave the state $3.8 billion in an upfront payment, which was probably the prime reason why this consortium got the bid, and the state was able to use that money then to support this Major Moves project, which again supported projects all throughout the state. So recycling the value of that asset from the northern part of the state through projects all throughout the rest of it. So it's important here, even though this isn't really part of the asset recycling part of it, it's important to talk about what happened to that project. The partnership faced troubles right from the beginning, due in part to the Great Recession and the big decline that we saw in vehicle miles traveled, particularly truck miles traveled. They really counted a lot on trucks to pay a lot of the freight for the private partner. That didn't happen. They got about half the traffic that they needed. They had a complicated financing scheme, actually should say increased their debt obligations from the private partner from $3.6 billion to $6 billion, and that made the whole thing go bankrupt. But the important thing to point out here is that due to the contract that the private partners in the state worked out, the taxpayers in the state really didn't suffer that much because the asset then reverted back to the state, which then they rebid out to a different set of private actors. So the important thing here to point out, again, is very similar to the last two. It's less about the transaction that occurred than how they were able to structure the contract, the way that they were able to use their expertise to make sure that the state was generally covered. And in this case, the private partner took a lot of the risk, and the state was able to recycle those assets, recycle the revenue into assets throughout the state. Whatever you think about the rest of the Major Moves program, notwithstanding, they were able to fund it through the sale of this. So just a couple of case study lessons here. The first thing, as Beth said, is very important to understand. Even though these are asset recycling schemes, All of those same questions that we've had about P3 still apply in this case. It doesn't obviate any of the concerns or any of the due diligence that cities, states, and metropolitan areas need to engage in for things like local control, ongoing maintenance, contracting expertise. All of those concerns and issues around P3 still apply when it comes into asset recycling, with some more nuances to talk about in a second. The second thing is that I think new institutions may be needed to identify and prioritize investments that benefit from this recycling. Because it is kind of new and because there is such a hunger for revenue dollars, I think there's a concern that if there was something that was identified that was going to spin off billions of dollars in revenue, that there would be a lot of interest and a political interest in putting that money in different places. An independent body can help ameliorate some of those challenges, give the public sector, give the general public confidence that the money is going to be spent in the right way, and can help to depoliticize that whole problem. It also provides some expertise because, as we know, there aren't a whole lot of P3 deals going on right now. That makes it difficult to build up expertise in cities, states, and metros. Some kind of independent body could help address that too. The third thing then is something that came out of the Australia models. We got to be careful of market distortions. We think there's plenty of opportunities for P3s throughout the country. They're certainly not going to solve all their infrastructure problems. They're certainly not going to support a $1 trillion federal infrastructure initiative, but there are places where it can be appropriate. The concern is whether or not government is actually incentivizing these investments to a way that distorts the market and actually takes an investment which may be perfectly fine for a public investment and makes it disproportionately attractive to a private partner. I think this is what we saw. One study said in Australia, but this was part of a larger scheme that the national government wanted to pull together. But it is important to understand that in each of these areas, it's important to figure out, are the new assets more valuable or less valuable than the asset that's being leased? If it's less valuable, then we really need to consider whether or not an asset recycling scheme is appropriate here. So just to sum up a little bit, again, there are really two decisions of asset recycling. All of those things around selling or leasing a publicly owned asset that we have with P3s. And then the second decision is then what do you do in that case with the funds that are generated? What kind of projects do you invest in? How do you prioritize? And are those the correct investments that meet a range of public policy goals and objectives? With that, let me turn it back over to Beth.
Thanks, Rob. I want to emphasize again that a properly staffed agency can get a lot of benefit from this tool, and learning from the successes of other areas is really important to understand all the options we have, especially working in such a financially constrained environment. Having every tool available to you is really important. One of the concerns, though, that have been voiced, not just within my organization, but also amongst some on Capitol Hill and across the country, is whether or not this is a strategy that is equally well suited for rural areas as for urban areas. And an analysis that was published by APM Reports in May shows that of the 520 projects submitted to the Trump administration for a possible inclusion in their infrastructure package, 46 projects have sponsors considering private financing, and only 2 of those projects are located in rural communities. We work a lot with rural mayors and county directors, and one of the things we hear regularly is, if they were sitting on large assets of great value that they could sell off, they would be in a much better situation overall. I think another point is that because of these smaller jurisdictions, not only do they have the same limitation in terms of just being smaller and not owning as many things that might be interesting to sell, but because they are likely to be utilized by fewer users and fewer people, it might not be as attractive of an asset to the private sector as a similarly situated asset in an urban area, because the revenue generation might not be the same. But the thing that is I think, more decisive to me about the concern is that in rural areas, cities or counties or just smaller agencies just don't have the staff able to do the analysis and the decision making to go toe to toe with a big company, and that's an issue on P3 overall. One of the parts of the Virginia story that I like very much is their leadership talk about the energy they put into raising the expertise of their agency to be able to handle these negotiations. And that's something I think all agencies could use more of. But if I were working in a rural area, I would want the help of a state agency or someone who has had experience with this area before I entered into any sort of negotiation with the private sector over asset recycling. And the last thing I'll point out is, if this creates a lot of opportunity in urban areas, the question then is, well, are we looking to sell assets in urban areas in order to fund rural areas? Or are we coming up with a great way for urban areas that already have access to more funding in a lot of ways because they have more people to get access to additional funding? And this is just something that we need to work through. It's not that I have a great, easy solution. It's just we shouldn't go jumping into this as a great solution without thinking through these challenges and making sure we can come up with a system that equitably addresses the needs of folks across the nation, both rural and urban. So final review, asset recycling. It's a type of public-private partnership that recycles the value of an asset into a broader array of benefits than just supporting the asset itself. It creates a source of short-term funding for a public entity that can be very important, but does not replace long-term funding opportunities. And with that, I think we are open for questions. And I have seen the chat box be quite active. So, Alicia, what do you have?
Okay, thank you, Beth and Rob. We're going to go ahead and start with the first one. And question number one is, if an asset recycling is a type of P3, what is the benefit of doing asset recycling versus a traditional P3?
Well, I'll take a run at that. I alluded to it in my final statement that with a typical P3, you are taking the value of an asset and you are utilizing it to manage that asset. So you've got a toll road, you're taking the tolls and you're using it to maintain the asset, and you are using it to make improvements, basic maintenance and improvements on that asset. With asset recycling, it can still be a toll road like in Virginia, but you're utilizing it for broader benefits. So it's not just about maintaining the toll road itself, it's about providing alternatives for those who might not have access to an automobile and be able to utilize that asset. Or it might be in giving transit to folks who don't want to pay that toll. They would rather stay off the toll road, and therefore you can do some congestion management too. So it's a broader array of benefits coming from the value of that asset.
And I'll say, I think it's interesting to note that there is a real dearth in P3s for transportation right now. Public Works Financing, I think, reported today or sometime this week that there's only been one deal, P3 deal that's been done in this calendar year since January 2017, and that is for the funicular in Los Angeles, right? It's a very small project. I-66, there's a couple of others that are going to come online, but there's a real there's a small pipeline, I guess for lack of a better term, right now. The pipeline isn't full of P3 projects. So there's a lot of interest in this right now because the assumption is that because there is private capital out there that's ready to invest, to encourage cities, states, and metros to look at those assets as potential revenue tools for other projects, because we have these two things happening at the same time. It's the lack of funding for traditional projects, projects that aren't appropriate for a P3, and then still this private capital is willing to invest. So the interest is trying to figure out new markets then for that capital, that private capital, and then support a bunch of public projects that aren't going to be able to be appropriate for those kinds of investments.
The next question is, in asset recycling, who gets the profits from the asset after the sale?
The owner of the asset. So if it's a local municipality that owns maybe a small general aviation airport and they want to sell that airport, then the owner of the asset, that local government, gets the benefits of the sale.
The next one, are there any guidelines in terms of returns that are required in order to go into the asset recycling agreement?
Oh, are there any guidelines? There's been a lot of talk about that in recent years, just in P3s in general, giving agencies that are just starting to figure out how to engage in a negotiation on privatization, what are the issues they have to worry about, what are the basic things they should make sure they protect in the public interest. And there is some information from organizations like and from USDOT has in their Build America Bureau are trying to really help agencies that want to figure out where to start in such a negotiation. But just like any contract negotiation, every negotiation is unique and will come up, with its own unique, or the negotiators themselves will come up with their own unique approaches, and everyone will turn out slightly different.
And this is where the Australia model is actually very interesting, because they did lay out a ton of guidance and a ton of rules for the municipalities and the states in that country to consider. I think the New South Wales model of establishing a new entity in order to review and to provide that expertise that Beth was talking about are very helpful. But we don't have that here in this country, other than what's going on in individual states like Virginia. So I think folks are looking for, I don't know if it's what they're expecting, but looking for the federal government, given what the president and the vice president, a lot of other folks have talked about and shown their interest in this, whether or not there's going to be federal guidance. There isn't any right now, as far as I can tell. But then trying to figure out, what is the federal role going to be here? As I said, in Australia, they provide a 15% match for these other projects, which is a significant incentive from the national government there. What's it going to look like here in the United States? Are they going to provide tax-exempt debt for private investors? There's a lot of things that have been bandied around, but none of that has been revealed yet. So we don't have any guidance from the national level.
We have heard some rumors that USDOT might use some of its competitive grant programs as a way to incentivize these sorts of deals. And so you might see something in Infra or Tiger saying, if you bring a deal like this to me, we'll give you money through the program. I wouldn't be surprised to see some things like that. I also want to point out, it's not a guideline, but I think the story of what Virginia did in saying, this is how much it would cost us to do all the things we want to do, and then take that to the private sector and say, look, if we did it on our own, it costs this. Can you beat it, is a good starting point. And where I think a lot of areas get in huge trouble is all they do is show up to the private sector and say, I need money. And that is a weak negotiating position to go into. But if you know what you want to do and how much you could pay, how much you can afford to do it, and you seek competition to lower that cost, that's a great starting place. I know that when I was talking about P3s with a former chief engineer from Texas DOT, he was saying one of the reasons they'd moved out of P3s is they knew how well they could deliver projects, which they were basically on time and on budget most of the time, and they could get a better deal through municipal bonds and through state bonds than they could get by going to the private sector. But there's a lot of questions they asked up front to be able to reach that conclusion. And so if I were to give folks advice about basic things you need to know when approaching it, is know what you want to get done and how much it would cost you to do it without anybody else's help.
Thank you, Beth. Another question, what was the time frame of the asset turnover for the examples given?
I don't know. I think in Virginia's case, it was baked into the deal. This was something that they came in with right away. And in Indiana, it was also part of the deal. Governor Daniels knew the statewide plan he wanted to get done, and he was looking at this as a way to directly fund that. So in both cases, they are very directly tied to one another. In Australia, I don't know the time frame. I think that is something that probably took some review by the infrastructure entity there, the governance structure they set up, but I don't know how long that was.
In any of the lease deals, is there a particular length of time that's kind of standard in that? 50 years?
we keep hearing that, right? It's 50, 75, 99 years. I frankly have a hard time understanding the length of those contracts. We know that in each of these P3 deals, it's a place where the private sector likes to park money for a long time. Even if it's just a small return, they like to have it something more predictable. It's tough for me to understand how you can figure out what's going to happen in 99.
Yeah, and I would say, in terms of being an owner, whatever you build, whatever transportation asset you build with money from asset recycling, it generally has a lifespan of 25 to 50 years itself. So if you're selling or leasing something for twice the life of the asset you're building, then you have lost that negotiation.
And that's actually a really important point that we didn't really dwell on enough, but I think it's coming out in the literature about this and what they've learned in Australia. And it's this emphasis on making sure that the projects that are being supported and funded by the asset recycling arrangements are more valuable than the project that's being leased or being engaged in the partnership with the private sector. And some of that's hard to quantify necessarily. It may not just be some kind of a revenue generating project, a toll road, for example. They might have other elements that fit into that value, things like air quality, environmental stewardship, social equity, accessibility, all those things that are maybe difficult to quantify. But if you're going to, as Beth said, if you're going to lease a public asset and then use that money for a project that's worth less than that asset that you just leased, then you really should probably rethink your model here.
Thank you. Do municipalities have varying laws related to what sort of approval an asset sale must have? For example, public votes, city council votes?
Absolutely. Every local jurisdiction and every relationship between the locals and their states are different. Even just figuring out how everyone funds their transportation system is very challenging. And it really varies by a great deal. So, you have to go and learn locally. I'll say it also varies locally what ownership locals have at all. I mean, if you're looking at the transportation system, one of the first things I do when I go into an area is just try to figure out who owns the roads, which varies widely. If you go to Virginia, Virginia owns every road in the entire state, including every alley. But if you go to a state like Wisconsin, the counties own most of their roads. And are responsible for maintenance of roads that they don't even own. So even just the fundamental issue of who owns and is in charge of the maintenance and the snow clearance and things like that of transportation assets varies wildly across the country, much less how you fund them, much less how you might utilize the asset through a lease or a sale.
Perfect. In regards to these deals, are they based on time leases or are the assets sometimes sold outright?
In these cases, each one that we've gone through today, they're timed. There is a year maximum. I don't think it's important to understand too. I think in most of these cases, I'm racking my brain thinking. In any of the cases, the assets aren't really being sold. It's a nuanced question, but it's important to understand that mostly these are examples where the public sector is retaining ownership of the assets. They're just leasing the operations and the ability for the private firm to generate revenue from tolls or other things off it. But in almost every case, the public sector continues to own that asset. They're just being leased to the private partner.
Thank you. So we have a longer question here. If legislation created incentive funds to encourage localities to do asset recycling, wouldn't the private partner be aware of a federally provided funds that the locality would receive and therefore reduce their bids accordingly? Therefore, doesn't this result in a transfer to the private sector more than a significant increase in public investment?
So it's a very good question, and one of the things that Rob hit on in his cautions were distortions to the market. And anytime the government is providing incentives to take on this kind of project, you run the risk of creating distortions. Either like the questioner just asked, which is, isn't it just a transfer to the private sector, to a distortion that would make a particular project look like a good investment when it really wasn't for the public. And so that is something that I know the Australians, when they reviewed the asset recycling deal that they had done, that was one of their big takings from it, is that they did think that having the federal government get involved and subsidize could create a distortion. And that is something we should be very aware of as we go forward.
And something you'll hear from some of the private partners is that they believe, I've seen this before, that that they're already discriminating against the private sector because, as we know, municipal governments, states are able to borrow money tax-free, where private partners are taxed on that debt. So part of what a lot of folks will tell you is that an incentive to level that playing field and allowing private sector debt to be tax exempt removes that discrimination. So you'll hear that argument from time to time as well.
We do have there's a lot of questions in regards to, are we going to share this presentation and recording after the webinar? Yes, we will. We'll be sharing this, not only the recorded webinar, but also the PowerPoint. And if you are a T4 America member, you also have received also a full summary of what is asset recycling. The next question is, what were some key differences with the new governance model that Australia used that added transparency versus the projects in the U.S.?
I'll say right off the bat, I don't know that we can make much comparison between Australia and the U.S. I don't think we haven't taken on anything that has the sweeping approach that Australia did. We don't have anything that's had really any mark of the federal government in it at all. So yeah, I have trouble comparing it to begin with.
Agree. They've got much longer history with this, much more expertise, much more routinized processes there. I do think in many cases the P3 deals are often more transparent because they do have to go through more hoops. And as Beth said, it's often easier to figure out where private partners are investing than where states or municipal governments are investing. So in a lot of cases, some of these can be more transparent. But it really, in the United States, it's going to be up to the city, states, and metro areas and how they organize these deals and the processes that they use. But right now, we don't have that kind of federal program, as Beth said.
Well, and we also just don't have enough projects in the United States to be able, to make any sort of sweeping generality about whether or not we've got good transparency or not.
By any measure, the United States is the laggard when it comes to P3s.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see another few other questions coming in, more about, will you get this presentation? Yes, you will. Right here, this one. So if the assets are being leased to private businesses, which is, and let me rephrase this one. Okay, that one, I'm sorry, that one I can't understand. Let's see. We're trying to get all the questions.
So I think this is interesting. Are public entities able to protect against tolls being raised drastically? This is a general P3 question, and it depends on how you structure your deal. And if you structure a P3 deal that gives more authority to the owner of or the whoever's leasing the asset to set the tolls, then they're going to consider that a much more valuable contract, and you're going to earn a lot more money off of it. The more you put restrictions on them, the less valuable it is. And while you might protect, certain public benefits, it reduces the value to the private sector, and you'll get less money from it. So it really depends on how you structure the deal. And there's a lot of issues like that in terms of, what user fees will be, in terms of what level of maintenance needs to be upheld, in terms of what happens when the entity or if the entity has monetary challenges. All of these are basic issues that needs to be addressed. And I think it goes back to that issue. I'll cite Virginia again. They said, I want to build these 20 things. I want to provide these various investments. It will cost me X amount to do this. Can you beat it? But they already had a pretty solid plan on what they wanted to accomplish and what they were willing to do and what they weren't willing to do. So when they went to the private sector, they had something to compare that against. And if the private sector came in and, for example, had said, we can provide everything you said that you wanted, we just have to quadruple the tolls, I don't know that Virginia would have signed that, but they at least knew what they were going to do. So again, they had a baseline, and that makes all the difference.
I think there's a lot of questions. So there was one, and very similar to others. What type of support, if any, does T4A or other agencies groups offer to jurisdictions that are interested in exploring opportunities for this type of P3?
In terms of T4A, we're certainly willing to give you our general knowledge and overview of best practices in this area and give you connections to folks who've had good or bad experiences so that you can gain more information. We really feel like peer-to-peer is really important in this because there are so many questions that come up in a process that can only be answered as you go along. So creating those relationships so that you can go back to that source and ask if they face something like that is really essential.
And there are a ton of training classes and things that are going on around the country. You can pay an awful lot of money to go to New York and take them. I think, as Beth was saying, that the best examples of these are when you're talking about a tangible project and something very specific. So the USDOT Center for Transportation went around the country. We did some of this with cities, states, and metros a few years back, and it was really valuable when we had a specific proposal to dig into because it made it very clear and very tangible for the public partners when they started to figure out what they were talking about. There was a project in the San Francisco Bay Area, in the North Bay, that was an unsolicited bid came in, and this was the first time that a lot of these commissioners had to even think about this. Once we started getting into the deal and pulling out the wires, it all became very clear and much more understandable. So I think it really helps when you're dealing with a specific investment. I believe the federal government, the USDOT, the Bannock Institute is providing some of that technical experience or technical expertise for folks. Maybe it's just for federally funded projects. I'm not entirely sure, but I think there are some resources at the Department of Transportation that are also designed to help out as well.
Yeah, and I think that Rob's instruction that you come in with an actual project and some real parameters is a good place to start. When I was at USDOT, we'd have a lot of people come in and say, we're really interested in this P3 thing, where do we start?
Right.
Well, we can certainly tell you some general issues you should think about as you start, but really at that point, it's just a 101. It's not really helping you think through the structure of an actual project. I recently went in to see the same folks to talk about a short line project, and we knew exactly how much investment they needed, what their revenues were, what the ownership structure was, whether or not the state had any ability to help, and presented something like that. And then they could talk through, various federal programs and how they can be assistant or helpful, and various approaches they've seen in other states that we might want to look into. So the more specific you can be about what you're looking to do, the easier it's going to be for you to get help.
Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and end it with one more question, and after that, we'll last comment, and we'll go ahead and end it there. What typically happens to workers' pay and benefits after one of these transactions?
Depends on how you structure your deal. You can certainly make specific requirements about unionization or certain pay or how many people are hired or whether or not they're hired locally. There's a lot that you can do, especially if you're not using federal dollars on these issues. But every restriction you add is going to reduce the value of the deal. And so that is a big part of the discussion for that agency, which is what are we looking to achieve? And if part of what you're looking to achieve is good paying jobs, and you know what those jobs will look like under a state-run program, then that's something you should think about when you go to the private sector and ask them for their thoughts about whether or not they can outcompete you. Because if that's a priority and they come in and say the way we're going to fund all these wonderful things is by paying people minimum wage, well then you know you're not getting what you want. You want to add anything to that?
I think that it's the private partners are becoming more cognizant of those concerns. It's clearly an area of public policy that policymakers care about. There was a transaction in New Jersey, Weehawken, somewhere up in northern New Jersey, where they leased the water system there to a private partner, and they made it very clear from the beginning that protecting existing workers was a paramount concern for the city, and they would not budge on that. And they were able to get the deal done and able to protect workers' pay and benefits and all that, because that was something, as Beth said, the city knew what it wanted to do, they baked it in up front, and they were able to get the deal done.
Well, and I'll also say, from the private sector's point of view, having a community that knows what they're looking to get out of the deal makes everything go much more smoothly. What often happens is someone walks in and they generally know that they kind of want to try this P3 thing, and then as the discussion goes on, they hear complaints from the public, and then they introduce new ideas to the negotiation. That's just not a very good way to proceed. So getting a real clear idea of what it is you want to do and how you could do it yourself will set you up for a good negotiation with anybody. So I want to thank everybody for joining the asset recycling webinar. If you have further questions, feel free to send them in. We'll try to answer anything that we see. We have additional resources both at T4A, and I'm sure Eno can point you in some directions as well. I've always encouraged folks to look at the USDOT site. They also have great assets, but I'll let Rob have the final word, but I just want to reemphasize again that this is a really important asset. It's a tool that should be in your toolbox. And knowing when it's well used, when it's a benefit to you, and when it's not is important. What it is not is a silver bullet, and it's not going to fix all of your funding issues. It's not going to guarantee that decisions are made any better than they are under any other regime. It's just another way to achieve goals with good leadership.
I just want to thank Beth and the T4A team for having me here today. This has been a very helpful conversation. I think that this is something that has become much more prominent nationally as folks are looking for what the national program is going to look like. As of today, we still don't have an infrastructure plan from the administration. I know a lot of folks are looking for it, and so anything that we can hint to, there's a lot of attention to. This is one of those issues that's getting a lot of attention, but as Beth said, it's not a silver bullet. It's not a substitute for funding, and all the issues around P3s still apply when you talk about asset recycling.
Well, thank you everyone again, and just as a reminder, I will be sending this out to everyone, the recording and the presentation, and as Beth said, if you guys have any questions, please let us know. Thank you.